Chairman, I want to try and focus in on who's covered and who's not covered by this legislation. I want the member in charge of the bill to give me an answer with regard to a group of offences as to whether they're covered or not. And the first pretty simple question is whether someone who is guilty of fraud is covered by this legislation. And then I'm interested in then is whether someone who has aided and abetted a fraud by being perceived to endorse a contract, whether that person is covered by this legislation if that is convicted. Does someone who is convicted of fraud, or can someone be convicted of fraud for an action which involves a New Zealand company but took place extraterritorially? Is that person covered by this legislation? Would they lose their right to vote? Would their status be changed? And would someone who endorsed a fraud which was committed offshore by a New Zealand company, if that person was a New Zealand citizen, would they be liable under this legislation, if convicted, to lose their vote? Would someone who fraudulently introduced someone to another party and then was involved with the other party in the theft of intellectual property, would that person be liable? Would the person who witnessed and endorsed and was perceived to give even government support to the commissioning of the fraud, would that person be someone who is caught by this legislation, or would that person not be someone who is caught by this legislation? Mr. Speaker, I think we have a series of arrangements here, sometimes in fact not that complex in this particular case, but we have international fraud occurring out of New Zealand. Theft of New Zealanders' intellectual property in China, but aided and abetted by a New Zealander or New Zealanders, depending on the level of knowledge of the people who were endorsing the particular commercial arrangement. And I'm interested, very interested, Mr. Chairman, whether the scenarios which have been set out in the House earlier by my colleague, Mr. Hodgson, which of those are caught under this legislation. And I see Simon Bridges, who is raising his eyebrows. I take from what he says that he thinks all of it is caught, and that the guilty parties who set up a fraudulent contract between a New Zealand company and a Chinese company will be caught, that the person who endorsed it, and with the perception that the New Zealand government supported it, will also be caught, that the person who then stole the intellectual property, and I understand $800,000, would also be caught, that the third party, the other party who was involved in the theft, because they were Chinese based and the offence occurred there, maybe wouldn't be caught. But I think probably not. I think if we were the US, they'd be caught. But I think given our intellectual property arrangements, they probably wouldn't be. Although if I were them, I wouldn't want to visit New Zealand in case they were caught. But of course, if they were Chinese citizens, they wouldn't get the vote. But the two New Zealanders. Well, the three New Zealanders who were involved in the arrangements, and certainly the person who did the introductions and is now a major shareholder in the company that is benefiting from the theft. They stole the intellectual property and then took shares in the company that stole it after being the people who introduced the people to the people in China, and $800,000 went missing as well. Well, I don't know, but I can't think of why a New Zealand minister would sign her name to a document which endorsed that sort of behaviour.
Order. The member is now linking an honourable member of this House to a matter which is hypothetical, and that is completely out of order. Up until that point, it was okay, but as soon as you mentioned a Minister of the House here, that is unacceptable. The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, I do not understand how any Kiwi would sign their name to such a... Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, I do not understand how any honourable New Zealander would sign their name, would endorse a document, would give the perception that New Zealand is behind.
Order. I want to bring the member back about relevance now. We're now straying into territory which is all hypothetical. We're on a bill. It's very clear what the bill's about, and I'll ask the member to come back to the point. Honourable Trevor Mallard.
I want Paul Quinn to tell us if the New Zealander who signed her name to such a document, and if she was convicted of fraud or aiding and abetting a fraud...
Order. I've already ruled that by mentioning a member, an honourable member of this House in a hypothetical matter is unacceptable, and I'll ask the member to detest from that...
You mean desist? I detest.
I ask the member not to go down that track again. That's my second time, and I won't accept it. Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, I want to ask Paul Quinn if someone who was convicted of aiding and abetting a fraud would lose their ability to vote under this legislation. Are they over the line or are they behind the line? I want to ask if someone who is convicted of aiding and abetting intellectual property theft is before the line or over the line. I want to ask the member whether someone who steals $800,000 or aids and abets someone who steals $800,000 is on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. Are those people affected by this bill? I look forward to Mr Quinn telling us how this legislation will make a difference to future behaviour. Will it stop Kiwis going to China, introducing parties and then stealing their intellectual property? Is that the intention of this legislation? Or is the intention of the legislation to stop people going to China and getting involved in thefts of $800,000 worth of cash? Is it the intention of this legislation? I presume, Mr Chairman, this is about trying to drive behavioural change on the behalf of Kiwis. It's a deterrent. It's a deterrent, says Paul Quinn. Will it deter Kiwis from going to China and stealing intellectual property from other New Zealanders while they are there? Will this deter New Zealanders going to China and setting up companies which take intellectual property from other New Zealanders? Is that the objective of this legislation? Or will the member accept that this legislation won't deter crooked Kiwis from doing that in the future?
I call Carol by